now that we have an overview of the DRA assessment, my question was, I teach a behavior class, and I have some students with autism in my class, and I have noticed that I have a hard time getting even my fluid readers past this level, level 3. And that is because the students have to retell the story, like Get Your Umbrella, like my student did. And although the students in my class are high functioning, having those pragmatic language skills they need to retell a story is hard. So even if they're fluent readers, they don't have the comprehension they need to go past this level. And my main concern with that is not so much that they're not getting higher levels, but that it concerns parents. And so I have wondered if this is the best way to assess my kiddos with autism. So I looked at some of the research on assessing students with autism, and mostly high-functioning autism, although I did look at, there was a little bit of research for kids probably who were nonverbal. But what I found was there is not a ton of research out there, and a lot of the research papers even said that more research needs to be done on autism and literacy in general. What I did find was that, so now I'm just going to go over a few bullet points about what we know about reading in children who have an autism spectrum disorder. These can be also found on my handout. We know that No Child Left Behind legislation mandates that all children be taught to read. We know, and read and assess, we know that many children who have autism spectrum disorders, even those kids who may have intelligence in the average range, they may show difficulty in acquiring reading skills. We know about 60% of students who have autism spectrum disorders may show below average performance in reading comprehension. And no matter where the students fall on the spectrum, they generally demonstrate well-developed word recognition skills. But again, reading comprehension is severely impaired, and that is like we looked at in the DRA level 4, where we asked the questions, asking the student to tell what was in the beginning, middle, and end. So that's where that goes back to the DRA and how we're looking at this assessment. We also know there was a small study that showed that guided reading can be beneficial for students who have autism spectrum disorders. And these students were assessed with the DRA and put into guided reading groups with students about their same reading level. And they read books on their level, and they were able to show an increase when measured against themselves in their reading skills after the guided reading groups. And this was in a very well-staffed classroom. So when we are specifically looking at assessments for children with autism, I did find one great article by Panter, Trimbath, and Westerfield from July 2016, and it was titled Reading Assessments in Children with Autism Spectrum Disorders. In that article, they gave some criteria for assessing students with autism spectrum disorders. So I first listed these, and these are in my handouts, some of these criteria, and at the end of my handout, I am comparing those criteria to what the DRA offers. So some of these criteria are that reading assessment should have a multidisciplinary approach. So that means not only the teacher should be assessing the student, but the speech therapist or the OT should be adding their input as well to the reading assessment. Also, a reading specialist would be a good person to help assess the student. The assessment should identify, again, the student's strengths and needs, which we talked about earlier. It talked about children who are hyperlexic. That means they may read early, or they may read above grade level, which is sometimes common with higher functioning students on the spectrum. And they shouldn't be overlooked for more in-depth assessments. Just because they can read the words doesn't mean that their reading comprehension may be on grade level. Assessments should take into account again the specific reading profile. So again, looking at comprehension or what that student needs. The use of tools such as social stories or visual aids can be used to help the student understand the context of the assessment. So you can use a social story to help the student understand why we are assessing and what that assessment means and how they should answer the questions, kind of the big picture of the assessment. They should be used to develop the results should be used to develop an individualized reading plan for the student that focuses again on strengths and needs. So use that knowledge you gain from the assessment. When doing the assessment, verbal ability should be taken into account, as well as mental age versus chronological age. So if you have a student who's chronologically 8 but has a mental age of more like 5, that should be taken into account when looking at the assessment results. We should also look at how the student may see details, or if they're a big picture thinker, and take that into account when we're giving the assessment. So if you're asking for what happens at the beginning of the story and they say the student went down the slide, that's a detail, instead of maybe the children walked to the park. Or looking at the executive functioning of the student, putting yourself in other people's shoes, kind of how that student overall understands the assessment and what you want from them. So putting that all together, when we're looking at the DRA, there are some pros and cons, I thought, after looking at the research of using that assessment with a student who has an autism spectrum disorder. The DRA does allow you to break down the student's results. That means you can look at the student's word fluency scores and see that they're high. You can also look at the reading comprehension scores and maybe they're on the lower side. That won't be every student, of course, but if we are looking at the research, that might be more common for a student who has an autism spectrum disorder. We also, the DRA gives you individualized reading plan for the student. It tells you what guided reading level that student should be on, and I did find research that supports use of guiding reading with the students. It also again tells you the student's strengths and needs, and helps you better understand where that student is. The DRA does not give much leeway on how you assess students. I didn't find anything in the instructions or the research about using accommodations with the DRA, or that you can ask the student to write instead of speak, or use visual cues. I did find some mention in the literature about putting those suggestions in the IEP to that way that you can use those tools on the DRA to help your student who has an autism spectrum disorder. I kind of thought more about talking to parents about the DRA results, because like I said at the beginning, that has been a concern, because they get concerned when you have to say, you know, your student is on a level 3, they're in 2nd grade, they should be, you know, on a level 18 or something. And the reason for that is they can't verbally tell me the beginning, middle, and end of a story. And I think just by giving some background of the DRA and showing them the book and showing them what the test is asking and saying these skills are what we're working with your student on daily, being able to verbalize, working on give and take and conversation. The score doesn't matter as much as how we're using the results. And I think talking to parents about that would probably make those numbers easier to hear and understand. So that is kind of my takeaway from using the DRA with students who have an autism spectrum disorder. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments and I will be glad to answer them. Thanks for listening.